less punctual tonight. So thanks very much. My name's Alex Perrottet. I'm the Dean of Warrane College. Welcome to all of you to the college for the 2024 Warrane Lecture. I'll just make some initial introductions and acknowledgements. Master Professor Gerald Fogarty, Chair of the Warrane College Council, Mr. David Bolton. I can't find him. Maybe he has. Oh, look at that. He's right down the back of the room. Former Masters. We are actually privileged tonight to have, I think, all four former Masters of the college, although I haven't seen Dr. Chris French just yet. But we have Father Joe Martins is here, the inaugural Master of the college for the first 24 years. Thanks for coming. Chris said he would be here. We have Emeritus Professor Tony Shannon and, of course, Professor Gerald Fogarty here. Other college councillors, Mr. Alistair Nicholas, Mr. Chris Kerrin, Mr. John Paul Bellardi, our special guest, Professor Tyler Vanderweel, residents, and former staff, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Warrane College. On topic tonight, from well-being to human flourishing, hope in the anxious century. We also welcome Professor Bill Pearson from New College next door. Thanks very much. He's also an adjunct professor at UNSW School of Civil and Environmental Engineering. Tonight's topic has much to do with the well-being of students, and we're grateful you can be with us as we've got a lot of common ground and it's a topic very close to our shared work. And we also welcome Ms. Edwina Hine from the New College Postgraduate Village. She's the Dean there just across the road. Thank you both for joining us tonight from the broader campus of UNSW. We also welcome our academic fellows. We have here in attendance tonight Professor Peter Heslin, Dr. Ian Goon, Dr. Ian Kwan, Dr. Craig Smith, Professor Jim Franklin. Thanks very much all of you for supporting and coming along. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the Director of the ACU Plunkett Centre for Ethics, Associate Professor Dr. Xavier Simmons, long-time resident and staff member of Warrane, now very much a full-time role at ACU. They're heading up the Plunkett Centre. He introduced Tyler to us for this event and put it all together, so thanks very much, Xavier, for making this happen. And Xavier himself has been spending the last 2 years working at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health alongside or for Tyler at the Human Flourishing Program. So we're also grateful to the Scots College Research Centre. So that is where Tyler has been stationed all of this week, and I understand they've been working him very, very hard. So we're also very grateful that he's been able to survive the week and to round it off with the Warrane Lecture here tonight. So thank you very much, Xavier, for making the connection and making this possible. Before we give a more in-depth introduction to Tyler, I'd like to welcome to the lectern the Master of Warrane College, Professor Gerald Fogarty, for some opening remarks.
So, welcome to the Warrane Lecture for 2024. I'd like to show my respects to acknowledge the Bedegal people, who are the traditional custodians of this land where Warrane College is located. I'd also like to show my respects and acknowledge those who have made Warrane possible and continue to make the college possible, both those living and dead. I'd like to also show my gratitude to God, who has given us this wonderful country, this time and this college to share, and to ask his help so that his will be done during our stewardship of the college. It's a pleasure to host many of you here at tonight's lecture. This is the 54th year of the college's existence in this building. Of course, the college is more than a building, it's the residents who live here. There are some stats I'd like to give you. 1/3 of the residents have had a family member who have either been a father or a brother here at the college, so it really is a family affair, our college. Over 40% of our residents achieve a weighted average mark of 75%, a distinction average, compared to the university's level of 11%. So here are young men doing well. After having the Intercollege Sports Shield 10 years in a row, we're trying hard to win it back, with teams training and holding their own on the field. We had a wonderful ball recently at Dalton House in Pyrmont. Our residents come from over 20 different countries. Our motto here at the college is leadership through service. The college aims to help young men achieve their full potential so they can take their place in being effective husbands, fathers and citizens of tomorrow's world. And we give that formation through a family environment which is led by our residential tutors and our activities committee, and we're very grateful to them for that. The annual Warrane Lecture is one of the time-honoured, most important traditions we have here in the college. We think the lecture is an important part of what makes us a college, an educational facility, educating the future generations and adding to the intellectual and cultural development of our nation. The first lecture was given in 1971, our year of opening in this building, by Sir Roden Cutler, VC, Governor of New South Wales. We have had the lecture ever since. Last year we had a debate on the Voice to Parliament with Dr Anthony Dillon and Associate Professor Sean Brennan. In 2022, John Anderson, AC, former Deputy Prime Minister, spoke about the role of authentic masculinity in a flourishing society. In 2021, General Sir Peter Cosgrove, former Governor-General of Australia and Chief of the Defence Force, spoke on Australia's emerging leadership role in the evolving world order. John Howard has spoken here, Paul Keating has spoken here. Thank you for your interest and your attendance here tonight. I'm sure it will be educative, enlightening and enriching. I look forward to discussing it further with you over supper afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerald Fogarty. Just to give you an idea of the format of tonight, I might just also mention, when we were giving our introductions, we mentioned former Master Professor Dr Chris French. He has arrived in that time, I think, as well as Dr Peter Heslin, one of our academic fellows, so thanks for joining us tonight. Tyler's lecture will go for about 45 minutes, and then we hope to have about 20 minutes for questions. So if you're listening in and you're formulating some questions in your mind, save them up, and at the end I'll go around with a microphone and we'll hope to take as many questions as we can fit in that time. Just bear in mind when asking your question to keep it brief, so no long statements or no long introductions. We're trying to prioritise Tyler's presence as well as his wisdom here tonight, so try to make those questions nice and concise, and we'll get more out of Tyler before he has to leave us. Now to formally introduce tonight's Warrain Lecture and our special guest. The World Health Organisation's Geneva Charter for Wellbeing was endorsed by participants in 2021, not long ago. It outlines 5 key action areas. The first is to design an equitable economy that serves human development within planetary boundaries, create public policy for the common good, achieve universal health coverage, address the digital transformation to counteract harm and disempowerment and to strengthen the benefits, and 5, to value and preserve the planet. This is a global health organisation that has global goals and a global outlook, no doubt, and those 5 issues are quite important to our world. But it's interesting to note that not one of them mentions the human person. Wellbeing is undoubtedly one of the most popular yet enigmatic topics or buzzwords of our generation, a generation described in the title of this lecture as the anxious one. Governments and universities have invested heavily in programs and organisations and policies tasked with improving wellbeing. The current leadership of this very university on which we meet today has appointed new senior level staff to work alongside the Vice-Chancellor on student and staff wellbeing. There's an app that students can download called Talk Campus, and they can use it to contact assistance online, and there's plenty of resources on the university's website. This naturally follows what many other organisations and even companies around the world are doing. Some even receive special mention online in awards lists for promoting wellbeing. Facebook provides exercise bikes for employees, wellbeing tick. Hilton hotels include their employees in their wellness and e-learning courses. Bupa has a program for workers called Smile. And Accenture has the Accenture Active app. And who can name a country around the world that hasn't already promoted and announced their wellbeing budget? Wellbeing is everywhere. I rediscovered this just this week when attending Mass in the college chapel with our chaplain, Father John Watson. He used the words, "in hope of health and well-being." I was paying a bit more attention than usual, maybe. That's from the Roman canon, which dates from around about the 7th century. So well-being is not new. It seems to be everywhere, and yet sadly, it is not. The National Study of Mental Health and Wellbeing, that's the ABS statistics. I'm not stealing Tyler's thunder with this. He's done a global survey and he's going to let us know about it in a minute. But just the latest from the Australian Bureau of Statistics from the 2020 to 2022 research, 42.9% of people aged 16 to 85 had experienced a mental disorder at some time in their life. and 38.8% of people between the ages of 16 and 24 had a 12-month mental disorder. In terms of seeking out help and assistance, out of those numbers, 21.6%, that's just over, one in five, of females saw a health professional for their mental health. 12.9% of males did. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare reports that on average Australians are rating their overall life satisfaction as getting worse. Now, as staff as residential colleges, we of course are deeply concerned about this, particularly with young people, because it's the young that are rating it far worse than the older people. The happiest demographic in that research was people over 70. I received an email this week from a manager of a company called Constant. Some of you might have heard, maybe Bill or Edwina have heard from them. I'm just going to quote a little bit from the email. We've collaborated extensively with residential colleges and various student accommodation choices as they begin to move away from the traditional RA model, that's resident assistant, or as we call them, tutors, to find options to work alongside your team. We've designed a service that incorporates professional extensions to your business model that either supports or substitutes the RA after-hours support staff, yielding outstanding outcomes. So can wellbeing really and truly be outsourced? As the traditional residential college fights for survival in Australia, there's never been a more crucial time for in-house personal care, one-to-one, looking at the individual. Tonight's lecture will take us to the core of the human person. It will go well beyond well-being towards a concept that now has its own field of study, human flourishing. Our speaker, Dr. Tyler J. van der Wiel, is the John L. Loeb and Francis Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health at Harvard University. He's the Director of the Human Flourishing Program. He's the Co-Director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality and Religion at Harvard University. He holds degrees from the University of Oxford, the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University in mathematics, philosophy, theology, finance and biostatistics. His methodological research is focused on theory and methods for distinguishing between association and causation in the biomedical and social sciences and on psychosocial measurement theory. His empirical research spans psychiatric and social epidemiology, the science of happiness and flourishing, and the study of religion and health. He's the recipient of the 2017 President's Award from the Committee of Presidents of Statistical Societies. He's published over 400 papers in peer-reviewed journals and is a well-published author. He writes a monthly blog on posting on topics related to human flourishing for Psychology Today. He'll enlighten us to the results of the longitudinal Global Flourishing Survey, which collected data from around 200,000 participants from 22 different places in the world, including Australia, and that cost over $40 million US. He'll touch on community, family, religion and society, and another word that really does need to become a buzzword today, hope. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Tyler J. van der Wiel.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and it truly is a pleasure and an honor to be with you here today and to be able to give this Warrain lecture on From Well-Being to Human Flourishing, Hope in the Anxious Generation. My plan for this presentation will be to first make some remarks on the nature of flourishing. What do we mean by the word? I will go on to talk about some of our attempts to at least crudely measure these notions of flourishing. And then we'll move into questions about how we might promote flourishing in practice, starting with the individual and what individuals can do, moving to communities, institutions, and then moving out further to questions of policy. More information on the framework for flourishing that I'll be presenting today can be found in this 2017 paper and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, USA. Some of the activities for flourishing and policies for flourishing that I'll be discussing can be found in this paper, Activities for Flourishing, an Evidence-Based Guide. And if you would like more information on the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard, you are welcome to visit our website. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our institutions and academic disciplines, we find that they often aspire to grand visions of flourishing. The World Health Organization's definition of health from 1948, still in place today, is that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The discipline of economics is sometimes described as the study of how agents go about maximizing their expected utility, supposedly taking into account all aspects of an agent's preferences. Discipline of positive psychology has sometimes been defined as the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. But in practice, many of our discussions and studies are often restricted to much narrower outcomes, specific disease states in medicine and public health, simple measures of feeling happy in psychology, or simply to income in economics. They miss these grand visions of flourishing. So what is flourishing? Well, if we turn to our dictionaries, the Oxford English Dictionary defines to flourish as to grow or develop in a healthy or vigorous way. The American Heritage Dictionary, to do or fare well. The etymology of the term comes from Latin, florere, to bloom, blossom, flower. It's the word sometimes used to translate Aristotle's eudaimonia, sometimes also translated as happiness. The working definition that we have been using at the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard is that flourishing or complete human well-being is living in a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good. So very broad, very all-encompassing, but this is arguably what we are seeking as individuals and should be seeking as a society. Conceptualized in this way, flourishing is an ideal. It is never something that is perfectly attained in this life, only relatively attained. Moreover, it's multidimensional. It concerns all aspects of a person's life. So one can be flourishing in certain ways and not in others. And we'll be repeatedly coming back to both the multidimensional nature of flourishing and its constituting an ideal. I think the discipline that has come closest to trying to capture and even measure these notions of flourishing is that of positive psychology. Many conceptualizations and measures have been put forward for well-being or flourishing, but notably absent from all of these psychological conceptions of well-being are any notion of physical health. And are we truly fully flourishing if we're terribly ill or bedridden? Again, perhaps we are flourishing in certain ways, but are we fully flourishing without health? Missing from many, though not all, of these conceptions and measures is any notion of character or virtue. Contrary to Plato, Aristotle, most of the Western philosophical tradition, and really cultural, philosophical, religious traditions worldwide. But with a conception so broad, we might wonder, can we ever really achieve consensus around this? Is it ever possible to measure? Surely notions of flourishing are going to vary across cultures, religions, philosophical traditions. Can we really make any progress? And while I do think it is the case that well-developed notions of flourishing will vary across traditions, I think we can also begin to focus on what might be common to different understandings of flourishing. And so what I would argue is that any reasonable conception of flourishing would include the following 5 domains of human life. Not that flourishing is reducible to these 5, but whatever else flourishing might consist in, it would include these 5 as well. And these 5 are happiness and life satisfaction, physical and mental health, meaning and purpose, character and virtue, and close social relationships. Again, the argument is not that these exhaust flourishing, but that each is a part of it. I think each of these 5 domains of life also satisfy the following 2 criteria. Each is nearly universally desired, and we have empirical data on this now as well. And each is its own end. It's sought for its own sake. It's not merely a means to some other end. And I think these two criteria of being an end and being nearly universally desired might help begin to shape some consensus around what to measure. As a very crude measure of flourishing, we've taken two questions in each of these 5 domains, drawn principally from the existing literature on well-being, questions already fairly common in use, so as to allow for comparison, and that have received some degree of empirical validation. The only 2 questions which were newly proposed were the 2 concerning character and virtue, and while there has been, I think, a great deal of good work done the last 2 decades on assessing character, most of it required long assessments for assessing a single character strength, maybe 20 questions just to assess courage, or 20 questions just to assess creativity. There was much less that was global in nature. So we worked with philosophers to try to develop a couple of questions based on the notion of the cardinal virtues that at the foundation of all moral virtues lie 4: practical wisdom or prudence, justice, fortitude or courage, and temperance or moderation. These 10 questions are as follows. The first domain, happiness and life satisfaction. First, how satisfied are you with life as a whole these days? Self-rated from 0, completely unsatisfied, to 10, completely satisfied. This is perhaps the most widely used question in the well-being literature. It's used in the UK's annual survey. It's been used by the OECD. It's been used by Gallup. It's been used by this year's US National Health Interview Survey, and by many others. We then supplement that with regard to another question about one's affective state. In general, how happy or unhappy do you usually feel? Self-rated from 0, extremely unhappy, to 10, extremely happy. Second domain, physical and mental health. These are just standard self-rated health questions drawn from the US General Social Survey and the World Health Organization's Mental Health Survey. In general, how would you rate your physical health, 0 to 10? How would you rate your overall mental health, 0 to 10? In the third domain, meaning and purpose. First, overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0, not at all worthwhile, to 10, completely worthwhile. This question also has been used extensively, once again, in the UK's annual survey, by the OECD, and many cohort studies around the world. But we supplement that then with something more cognitive. I understand my purpose in life. From 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree. The fourth domain, character and virtue. The first question trying to, at some very crude way, get at practical wisdom and justice. I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations. Self-rated 0, not at all true of me, to 10, completely true of me. And then a second question intended in some crude way to try to get at fortitude and temperance. I'm always able to give up some happiness now for a greater happiness later. And then finally, the fifth domain, close social relationships. These 2 questions were taken from the UK's Campaign to End Loneliness survey of short social connectedness assessments. First question, I am content with my friendships and relationships. 0, completely disagree, to 10, completely agree, intended in some sense to try to get at the quantity of those relationships. And then second, my relationships are as satisfying as I would like them to be, trying to get at the quality of those relationships. In most of our work, we report the results separately across the domains, because as you will be seeing shortly, the dynamics across the domains can be quite different from one another. Sometimes we will average the 10 questions for a crude assessment of flourishing, but really this should be understood as nothing other than an average of those 5 more meaningful domains. We also typically supplement these 10 questions with 2 others on financial and material stability as important means to sustain those other ends. These 2 questions drawn from the financial well-being literature are as follows. How often do you worry about being able to meet normal monthly living expenses? 0, worry all the time, to 10, do not worry at all. How often do you worry about safety, food, or housing? Again, we'll typically report this domain separately as well. Sometimes we'll average all 12 questions for a more secure assessment of flourishing, perhaps less satisfactory conceptually, as these financial resources are means, not ends, but perhaps more satisfactory in practice insofar as indicating flourishing over a longer period of time. I won't bore you here with the details of the psychometric properties of this measure, but we've published a number of papers on how this performs across different cultural settings. I'll be speaking about research uses and community uses of this assessment, but I think it can also be helpful for purposes of self-reflection, for evaluating what is going well in life and what might not be going so well, for identifying areas one wants to improve, changes that one might want to make in life. When taken repeatedly, it allows one to track over time what is improving, what is staying the same, what may be getting worse. When we've employed this assessment in a number of workplace and educational and clinical settings, some of the feedback we've had are some of the questions made me stop and think. It was pretty eye-opening to see the areas that I really need to work on. Relief that someone is asking, I want help in certain areas. Slightly caught off guard with the questions around purpose. Missing a greater purpose, need to reach out to help more and give back. One woman, after taking the survey, said after months of debating back and forth whether she would join a volunteer organization, decided after the questions around purpose she really did want to, and she was going to commit to doing so. So again, we will shortly turn to research uses of this assessment, but I'm going to do something slightly unconventional during a lecture and pause for 2 minutes to give you all some time to reflect on these questions in your own life. Don't worry, I won't be collecting data here and now, but we'll pause for a minute or two. So, as I said before, I think this can be useful for purposes of self-reflection, but when collected at the community level, I think it can also give insight into what is going well in a community, what is not, who needs help, and in what ways. And so simple descriptive data collection, I think, can be quite useful. And we've been doing this at the national level in the United States starting in 2020. And so here's data on roughly nationally representative samples of the United States across these flourishing domains in January of 2020, before the World Health Organization's declaration of the COVID-19 pandemic, and then 6 months later in June of 2020, in the midst of the pandemic. In January of 2020, the average across almost all of these domains was about 7 out of 10. With the exception of financial and material stability, essentially a full point lower. And we've seen this in many, though not all, of our samples in other countries as well, that people are truly struggling with those means. And so it's important to address that as well. Perhaps unsurprisingly, flourishing declined during the COVID-19 pandemic. But what was interesting is different domains were affected in different ways. Happiness and life satisfaction, again, perhaps unsurprisingly, fell fairly substantially, 0.7 of a point. Physical and mental health, likewise, perhaps unsurprisingly, fell 0.7 of a point. A large fall in financial and material stability. And June of 2020 was, in fact, the height of unemployment in the United States. But what's interesting is some of the other domains did not change as much. Meaning and purpose went down 0.4 of a point, but not as much as those other domains. Our character assessments were essentially level. And somewhat surprisingly, close social relationships assessments went down a little bit, but not nearly as much as we had anticipated. This was corroborated by other evidence as well that had suggested that loneliness had gone up a little bit, but not as much as one might have guessed. And it seems that while certainly this was a difficult time for many. For some, this may have led to greater investment in family relationships or those one was living with, may have allowed for connection to relatives who were elsewhere. There was evidence that children felt closer to their fathers during the pandemic than prior to it. Importantly, however, these means do disguise variability, and you can see that the standard deviation, the variability across these domains went up during the pandemic. So while for some, the pandemic may have been a time of investing in family, for others, perhaps especially those living alone, this was perhaps an especially challenging time. And so it is important to look at not just the means, but the distribution and those struggling most as well. We've continued to track this data every year. By January of 2021, flourishing scores had about halfway recovered. By January of 2022, and this was in the midst of Omicron, scores were almost back to their pre-pandemic levels. But by January of 2022, a new pattern began to emerge, and that was with age. The traditional relationships between age and well-being, assessed principally by happiness and life satisfaction, have generally been U-shaped. Those younger and those older typically reporting higher levels of well-being, those in midlife perhaps struggling with young children and aging parents, and career challenges generally reporting lower levels of well-being. However, what we've seen over time, and this began prior to the pandemic, is that that left part of the U began flattening. Young people weren't doing as well as they used to be. That was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic itself, and in January 2022, for the first time in the United States, we saw that each of these dimensions were strictly increasing with age. Young people, those aged 18 to 25, were reporting the lowest scores across each of these flourishing domains. And so I think this really should give us cause for concern. How are policies supporting or not the well-being of young people? What might we do to address this? Is there hope for subsequent generations? And as you'll see shortly, similar patterns, in fact, pertain here in Australia. To try to understand these dynamics and the determinants of flourishing, we've been collecting this sort of data in a variety of different settings: workplace settings, employees at Aetna, Kohler, Owens Corning, the World Bank, factory workers in Mexico, Poland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, China, a group of international flight attendants. Delta Airlines recently used the survey with all 80,000 of their employees. We've embedded this flourishing assessment in various epidemiologic cohort studies, used it in various clinical studies, have partnered with a number of universities, data collection as well, various secondary schools, national survey in the United States of Catholic priests. And our largest data collection effort to date is a global flourishing study in collaboration with Gallup and Baylor University. This is a study of 200,000 individuals in 22 different countries, representing about half of the world's population, with nationally representative samples in each country. And we will be following this group of 200,000 individuals once a year for 5 years to try to understand both the distribution and the determinants of well-being and these different aspects of flourishing. What sorts of behaviors, community commitments, aspects of religious and spiritual participation, economic and political situations, family experiences go on to shape these various aspects of flourishing. This is an open access resource hosted by the Center for Open Science, so anyone can access this data. The first wave of data was released this past February. We have a team of about 40 researchers at present writing 100 papers trying to understand flourishing at a global scale, but we hope other researchers and journalists and policymakers will use this for various purposes. Some of the initial insights from these analyses, when aggregated over those 22 countries, are that men and women report roughly similar flourishing scores. Globally, men very slightly higher, but not much. But there is variation across countries. In Japan, for example, women report considerably higher flourishing than men. In Brazil, it's the reverse. Men report higher flourishing than women. In many countries, again, including Australia, we see this pattern of increasing flourishing with age. So that applies here in Australia, but also Argentina, Brazil. Not all countries. In Egypt and India, we still see the traditional U-shaped patterns. In Spain, it's in fact mostly U-shaped except for the youngest group, which is doing the worst. So one can almost see or feel that decline happening in real time. One of the other interesting observations is that while perhaps unsurprisingly, happiness and life satisfaction is reported higher in richer developed countries than poor developing countries, the reverse is the case with meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose is reported higher in poor developing countries than the richer developed world. I think this gives rise to important questions with regard to how can we carry out economic development in ways which do not compromise meaning and purpose. Replicating much prior research, on average across these 22 countries, those who are employed, those who are educated, those who are married, those who are religious tend to report higher flourishing scores than those who do not. But there are exceptions. In Australia, for example, we see the pattern with education and flourishing not to be strictly increasing with education, but more U-shaped. Those with 9 to 15 years of education are doing worse than those with high levels of education or low levels of education. The self-employed in Australia report especially high levels of flourishing compared to global averages. And so I'll briefly go through a little bit of just the purely descriptive data from Australia. This is a roughly nationally representative sample of about 4,000 individuals with data collection, mostly in end of 2022 and into 2023. You'll see on the scale from 0 to 10, once again, that youngest age group, those 18 to 24, are reporting the lowest flourishing scores, and it does strictly increase with age. Those 80 and higher report the highest levels of flourishing, almost 2 points higher than those 18 to 24. In terms of demographic descriptive variables, we see the largest discrepancies by age, much more so than by race, than by religion, than by employment, than by marital status. So again, it's very sobering data. Is there hope? What are we to make of the anxious generation? And should we have ourselves anxiety about these trends, about the future of society? In Australia, men and women really do report almost exactly the same flourishing scores, 1/100th of a point higher for women than men, but well within the bounds of statistical uncertainty. With regard to marital status, again, we see relatively high flourishing scores for those who are married compared to essentially almost all other groups. But one of the striking things with the data in Australia, which we don't see in many other countries, is those who are widowed report especially high flourishing scores as well. So what to make of this exactly, I don't know. Certainly that's also correlated with age, which we know comes into play. But maybe there's a gathering around those who have lost a spouse here in ways that don't take place elsewhere. But that was one of the quite striking features of the Australia data especially. And then we see, as we do in almost all countries, a fairly strong gradient between religious participation and flourishing, particularly religious service attendance, with those who attend more than once a week reporting more than a full point higher in their flourishing assessments than those never attending. Should be noted that these are purely descriptive analyses. These should not be interpreted causally. I will be coming to causal evidence shortly, but right now we're simply trying to describe flourishing across the globe and how this varies by demographic groups and how those demographic relationships themselves vary across different countries. I do now want to turn to this question of, is there hope? And what might we do to improve and enhance flourishing. And again, I will start at the most individual level, self-directed activities to promote flourishing. I will move on to communities and institutional commitments, and then we'll broaden the lens further and talk about policy and society. At the individual level, there's been a fair bit of, I think, very high-quality work that's been done in positive psychology on simple, easy-to-use activities and interventions that have been found to promote various aspects of flourishing. These activities have been evaluated in randomized trials, the same sorts of rigorous designs that are used to assess cancer treatments or vaccines, and have been found to have effects on various well-being outcomes. So perhaps the best studied of these are gratitude exercises, simple exercises like 3 times a week. Write down 3 things you're grateful for and why. That exercise, compared to just writing about some neutral activity, has been shown in randomized trials to have had effects on increasing happiness, reducing depressive symptoms, improving quality of sleep, reducing self-reported health symptoms, even 6 months out. Another of these sorts of activities is practicing acts of kindness, sort of intervention along the lines of, for 6 weeks, commit to finding 1 day each week and carry out 5 acts of kindness that you would not otherwise do. And it takes quite a bit of planning to get all 5 in on 1 day. But the research suggests that that's much more effective than spreading them out over the course of the week. Possibly that effort to plan and to act in a single day helps form the habit, which may make one more generous and compassionate and kind towards others in general. But again, randomized trials indicating participation in this activity increases happiness, sense of social connectedness, sense of flow in life. And I myself do try to practice some of these. We do gratitude exercises around the dinner table with our children, and I feel I notice the difference between those weeks we do and those weeks that we forget. These acts of kindness, it's difficult to sustain over long periods of time, but every Lent I find, this is a perfect 6-week period to try to engage in this. And I notice the effects continue on for weeks that follow. Another such activity is using character strengths in new ways. There are assessments, for example, the Values and Action Institute on identifying, say, your top 5 character strengths out of a list of 24. And these activities are then to use your top 5 character strengths in a new way once per week for 5 weeks. And again, randomized trials indicating that engaging in that versus some neutral activity increases happiness, lowers depressive symptoms, once again, even 6 months out. Of course, we want not only to promote positive well-being, but also to address matters of psychological distress. And similar evidence-based resources from randomized trials that are self-directed have likewise been developed to this. David Burns' Feeling Good book has been evaluated in a number of randomized trials and shown to have effects on alleviating more mild forms of depression, not a substitute for psychiatric care, but again, for more mild depressive symptoms can be helpful. Likewise, Barlow and Kraski's Mastery of Your Anxiety and Panic has been evaluated in one relatively small randomized trial, but found to have similar effects on reducing anxiety. We've in fact recently just completed a large randomized trial of a forgiveness workbook intervention, distilling about 30 years of work in clinical psychology on forgiveness based on Everett Worthington's REACH model of forgiveness into a 2 to 3 hour self-directed workbook that can be done on one's own. We evaluated this workbook in a trial of about 4,500 participants in 5 relatively high conflict countries: Colombia, South Africa, Ukraine, Indonesia, and Hong Kong, and found effects of using this workbook on promoting forgiveness, but also on reducing depression, reducing anxiety, increasing hope, and increasing those flourishing scores. And so these results were just published earlier this year in the British Medical Journal, Public Health, and we're hoping to now disseminate this powerful resource. The evidence for these various interventions can be found in this paper on activities for flourishing, along with a number of others. We have consolidated some of these evidence-based activities into a flourishing app, which you can freely use and download. But again, most of these can really just be done on one's own with pen and paper around the dinner table or so on and so forth. But these are easy to employ, they're easy to disseminate, they're free, and I think if we were to do so in schools, in workplace settings, in neighborhoods, in college life, and to run campaigns to provide this sort of information and opportunities to practice these things, population well-being would increase. The effects aren't huge, but they're meaningful, and they have the potential for very widespread dissemination. Interestingly, most of these studies have indicated effects either on happiness or on health, rather than some of these other aspects of flourishing. The effects are much less clear on purpose in life, or on character, or on relationships. Some of the positive psychology interventions that have been designed to help people find purpose and meaning in life have failed. Much of that work is not even published. And I think to change these other aspects of individual flourishing, of purpose, character, relationships, sort of individual, self-directed activities on one's own probably are not sufficient. I think for these other aspects of flourishing, we need communities. We need longer-term commitments in relationships. And so it's to those communal pathways to flourishing that I will now turn. And I will do this through the lens of my own discipline, public health. We generally think of the public health impact of an exposure, an intervention, or a phenomenon as a function of two things. First, the prevalence of the exposure, how common is it in the population? And second, the size of its effects. Something common in the population, which has large effects on the outcomes that we care about, is going to shape population health. So if we use this lens for physical health, for example, we're led to things like exercise, nutrition, not smoking, having adequate sleep. But if we broaden our perspective and ask what's common in the population and has effects not just on physical health, but also on happiness, mental health, meaning, character, and close relationships, I think the list looks rather different. And based on a review of the literature restricted to more rigorous longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs, I would propose 4 communal pathways. These are family, work, education, and religious community. Again, evidence from more rigorous longitudinal, experimental, and quasi-experimental designs that each of these has large effects across those flourishing domains, and each is relatively common in the population globally. The argument's not that these 4 are exhaustive. There can be other very important pathways to flourishing for particular individuals. Deep engagement in the arts, for example, might, for some, affect all 5 of those flourishing domains, but such deep engagement is perhaps less common in the population. But in any case, the argument's not that these 4 are exhaustive, nor that these 4 are necessary. One can flourish in the absence of one or more of these pathways. Rather, the argument is that each of these powerfully affects those flourishing domains and is common in the population, so that if individuals were to choose to participate in these communal pathways, or if policy efforts were made to support them, population flourishing would increase. The evidence from this comes from and is presented in that paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences from 2017. If you'll permit me for one slide to put on my hat as a methodologist here, do want to review some of the principles of causal inference to try to assure you that we have evidence for causation here. So this review was restricted to these more rigorous designs. Cross-sectional designs, where all the data was collected at the same time, are excluded because they are essentially useless for examining causality. And that's because we can't determine the direction of causality from data all collected at once. So as examples, marriage and happiness are strongly associated with one another but is that because marriage gives rise to happiness, or is that because happy people are more likely to go on to get married? There's evidence for both, but we can't tell with data collected all at once. Likewise, religious service attendance is associated with lower levels of depression. Is that because religious service attendance protects against depression? Or is it because those who become depressed withdraw from religious communities and other forms of community life as well? Again, with cross-sectional data, we can't tell, though there's evidence for both. So ideally, we want longitudinal studies over time, controlling for the outcomes we care about at baseline that are robust to potential unmeasured confounding, with data coming from multiple sources and meta-analyses of these longitudinal studies, synthesizing all the evidence from more rigorous studies. When I carried out this review, for some outcomes and relationships, this required discarding the vast majority of the studies. Although there have been over 100 studies on religious participation and happiness, I could find in 2017 only one that was longitudinal over time. 99% were discarded. This diagram here, however, does present the state of the evidence as of 2017. On the left, the 4 pathways to flourishing. On the right, those 5 flourishing domains. The numbers on each of the arrows corresponds to references in the paper to studies with more rigorous longitudinal experimental or quasi-experimental designs. In some cases, the evidence was already then quite substantial. In other cases, it was perhaps just 1 or 2 studies supporting the effect. The evidence base has increased quite dramatically over the last 7 years and has continued to support all 4 of these pathways. So individuals can choose to participate in work, in family life, in education, and religious community. But I think policy efforts can also be made to support these various communal pathways. And I think if we focus on flourishing and those domains of flourishing, rather than perhaps just restricting our attention to considerations of income and health, we may be led in different sorts of policy directions. I could spend a whole additional lecture on these policy implications, but would like, for the sake of time, to just offer one example for work and welfare policy. I think much welfare policy is well-intended and provides material sustenance, access to health care, which is critical, which is needed. But I think it's important to design welfare policy so as not to disincentivize work. Because although work is often the pathway towards income, and my country at least, towards access to health care even, work does more than that. Work provides for many a sense of meaning and purpose. It allows them to use their strengths. It provides a forum to build relationships. And if we simply provide basic income and access to health care without providing for these other aspects of flourishing, I think we are doing a disservice to the flourishing of those we are trying to serve. So I think things like supportive employment programs for the disadvantaged and the mentally ill that help them to find longer-term forms of suitable employment. These have been evaluated in randomized trials and found to be effective. I think these sorts of programs can be very helpful in supporting not just the material necessities of life, but those deeper aspects of flourishing as well. I think similar policy considerations can pertain to marriage, to education, to religion. In the United States, for example, welfare policy disincentivizes marriage by often having people lose their welfare benefits. And again, I think this does a disservice to the flourishing of society. Online marital counseling programs, which are cheap and easy to disseminate and evidence-based, I think are things that could be spread throughout society to help those struggling in marriage before things get so bad that divorce seems the only option. With regard to education, I think trying to ensure access to good teachers for all students is essential. I think also a compelling case can be made for school choice to support a diversity of ends within education. And I think Australia does a much better job at this than perhaps most of the rest of the world. With regard to religion, I think ensuring religious liberty, free practice of religion will help ensure that these religious communities are able to serve and promote the flourishing of those who choose to attend. I think we should also correct unbalanced portrayals of religion in both media and academic work. Certainly, religious groups have done harm, and that needs to be acknowledged and addressed. But the evidence indicates that they also contribute tremendous good, both to those participating and to broader society. And so I think we need a balanced portrayal of religion. I want to conclude by taking a step yet further back in thinking about flourishing and thinking about society. And I'll begin to do so by trying to draw distinctions between flourishing and well-being. In much of my own speaking and writing, I will often use the terms interchangeably, but I think there are subtle differences in connotation, and I think we can provide definitions which bring out those differences. And so while the words well-being, thriving, flourishing are often used interchangeably, again, I think our understandings of those words are slightly different. Thriving almost suggests doing well in spite of the environment, whereas I think flourishing suggests a certain consonance with the environment, with the communities and contexts in which one lives, the context supporting the well-being of the individual. If we think about well-being, I would say well-being is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good as they pertain to that individual. Whereas flourishing is the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the contexts and communities and environments in which that person lives. So we might say someone could attain a certain level of well-being in a very corrupt environment, but they are not fully flourishing because the community around them is not good. I think this broader notion of flourishing also captures one's participation in the common good. The community's well-being is part of one's own flourishing. We are not fully flourishing if those around us are not doing well. We have a responsibility for their well-being. Their well-being is part of our flourishing. And once we broaden to consider flourishing with respect to the contexts and communities and environments in which a person lives, we're led to consider those factors that are shaping our own flourishing and that of all in our community. Aspects of community life, like relationships, participation in community, the demographic composition of the place we live, religion, governance, infrastructure, economics, traditions, culture, language, all of this really is within the purview of flourishing and should be considered as contextual drivers of well-being. These contextual drivers of well-being are part of our own flourishing. In terms of trying to operationalize this, our first pass at doing so is in collaboration with Dennis Snower at the University of Oxford, former dean at the Said Business School there, and he has developed what he calls a SAGE framework to begin to try to capture some of these contextual drivers of flourishing. Each letter of SAGE stands for a different component in his conceptualization. S, solidarity, support, sociality, minority experiences. A, agency, matters of institutional confidence, freedom, community infrastructure. G, economic gain, GDP, simple measure there, but important when we think about the means to sustain flourishing. And E, the environment. And so using data from Gallup and also external sources with respect to GDP, the Environmental Performance Index, we are trying to quantify and operationalize in some crude manner these four different components of the contextual drivers of flourishing. We're linking the SAGE data to that of the Global Flourishing Study to, again, better understand how these contextual drivers of flourishing shape and are related to individual experience. So we hope to learn from the Global Flourishing Study. We hope to learn from this SAGE framework, from this broader understanding of flourishing. And we're trying to make progress on other fronts as well. We've developed measures not just of individual flourishing, but of communal well-being. Not just are all individuals in the community doing well, but is the community flourishing as a community, looking at things like relationships within the community, proficient leadership to help guide a community well, healthy structures and practices to sustain the life of a community and to resolve conflict, questions of whether there's a sense of belonging and welcome within the community, whether there's a shared mission or purpose. And we're applying this to school communities, university communities, family, religious communities, cities, nations even, and have a template for doing so. One aspect of well-being which I have not discussed is spiritual well-being. And for those who take a more spiritual or religious perspective to life, often this is considered the most central part of flourishing. If we define flourishing as all aspects of a person's life are good, then for someone who does religious or spiritual framework, spiritual well-being should be included in this also. I think to do this well, we in fact need tradition-specific measures and assessments. How spiritual well-being is understood in the Christian religion will be very different from Buddhist traditions or Muslim traditions. And so we've been gradually developing tradition-specific assessments of spiritual well-being. We've also been doing work on more extensive assessments across the different flourishing domains. 2 questions on something like purpose and meaning or character is unquestionably inadequate in terms of understanding the complexities and nuances of people's lives and experiences. And while I would maintain that some assessment is better than none at all, in many cases I think we can do much better. Something will always be missing from our measures. Measures are always inadequate and partially incomplete, but I think we can make more progress and more extensively assessing these different domains of flourishing. We've developed a comprehensive measure of meaning to distinguish between meaning and purpose. Purpose really being more indirected, meaning understanding the broader context of things, looking at both objective and subjective dimensions of meaning, both more global and individuals, understandings of coherence in life. We've developed more extensive assessments of social flourishing, looking at both positive and negative aspects, both relationships and communities, as well as emergent goods that come out of communal life that cannot be reduced to their contribution to any individual. With regard to character, we have a large funded project from the John Templeton Foundation looking at assessments of different forms of interpersonal love. Romantic love, yes, parent-child love, but also love within friendship. Love of neighbor, love of enemy. Certainly within the Christian tradition, these notions of love are central to our understanding of ethics and of flourishing itself. So we think we should be more adequately assessing these notions of love and to begin tracking at a national level whether love of neighbor, whether love of enemy is increasing or decreasing over time, and what might be done and might this contribute to our political divisions and trying to resolve them. We've been trying to incorporate non-Western perspectives into this work as well, working with the Japanese Wellbeing for Planet Earth Foundation and Gallup to try to better understand how different cultures understand well-being. One of the things that has emerged from this work already is that notions of peace, balance, harmony, while perhaps universally desired, are given much greater emphasis in the East than in the West. And so we've been trying to incorporate such measures also into our global flourishing study. And finally, trying to adapt these assessments to specific populations, to adolescents, and how might we understand their development and flourishing, and work that Xavier led to end-of-life settings, and how can we think about flourishing in the context of an approaching death. So in conclusion, I do think flourishing pertains to all aspects of life. This is, of course, important personally, but also in research and for policy. Is there hope? I think there is. I think we are gradually learning about flourishing. We know activities at the individual level that can promote flourishing. We know about communal pathways that can promote flourishing and can gain insight into policies that can advance these. We can take more seriously notions of the common good and our participation in it, and work towards that together. The path won't necessarily be easy, but I do think there is hope in advancing flourishing. I think the research itself contributes to that hope, to that knowledge. But I think for it to do so, we need to more broadly assess flourishing in a range of settings. We need to look at a whole range of flourishing outcomes in our research. We need better research support for this from governments, from universities, and hiring decisions. Yes, we should continue to look at income and physical health, but we should broaden our lens and try to carry out similar rigorous research on meaning, on character, on social relationships. Why is it that we know so much more about the determinants of cardiovascular disease than what gives rise to a sense of meaning and purpose in life, despite that being a desired goal of everyone? And I'm all for the study of cardiovascular disease, but I think we should be devoting similar efforts to meaning and purpose, for example, as well. I think governments can and should start tracking these various flourishing measures, and I think we have seen a fair bit of progress on this over this past decade. We're still quite behind in this regard in the United States, but even some signs of hope there as well. Likewise, I think employers, medical centers, schools, universities, residential colleges could start tracking flourishing over time and seeking ways to improve it. I truly believe that what we measure shapes what we discuss, what we know, what we aim for, and the policies put in place to achieve it. So I think we should be aiming for flourishing both personally and as a community. Thank you all for being here tonight. Truly is a pleasure, and happy to take any questions, comments, critiques, so on and so forth. Thank you.
Hello, I'm a pediatrician, so I just want to know, does your data include children?
The Global Flourishing Study does not. It's aged 18 up. There is a group that is interested in extending data collection to perhaps 12 to 18 year olds, possibly starting with the 3 countries we have in Latin America. So the Global Flourishing Study may eventually do so, but does not at present. We do have, however, studies on flourishing in various schools and educational settings. We've adapted the flourishing assessment for use amongst adolescents, replacing 4 of the 12 questions with those which are more age appropriate. Christina Hinton at our program is also now working on adapting it for 9 to 11-year-olds, keeping the domains but replacing all 12 questions. That 9 to 11-year-old assessment is still in a piloting phase, but we've been using our adolescent assessment fairly extensively.
With regard to the items regarding character and virtue, I'm curious about the rationale for using the absolute word always in the item. And the second thing is, I know it's descriptive and you wouldn't have data to measure this, but do you think that use of social media could be underlying some of the age-related effects? And the rationale there is, we don't answer these questions absolutely. We think, how satisfied am I relative to others? And there's all that research showing that social media makes people think relative deprivation, they're doing worse than others, and perhaps that's underlying their lower well-being relative to older people who presumably don't look at social media as much.
Yeah. So maybe I'll start with the second question and then go back to the first. With regard to the role of social media use, I do think it's had a role in the declining well-being amongst youth, both with regard to the effects of comparison and unrealistic ideals that are being presented, but also negative effects in its own right. And increasingly, both observational and randomized trials have indicated that extensive use of social media does decrease well-being. It has the opposite effect of what face-to-face interactions have. I think, moreover, it's changing the opportunities that even adolescents have who don't want to engage in social media because there aren't others around to be with, to engage. So I think it's really lowered the bar substantially for everyone. Many of our comparisons suggest meaningful but smaller effect sizes, but I think it's because it's gone down for everyone. We've not really taken into account the opportunity costs. That said, I do not think that is the only factor driving those declines in well-being amongst youth. I think economic opportunities are part of the picture. I think COVID-19 disproportionately affected youth. While the lockdowns had adverse effects for everyone, it's much easier to sustain a relationship or community that you already have than to build one online. And so again, I think during a critical developmental period, young adults were prevented from the formation of relationships in communities. Likewise, I think declining rates of religious participation in marriage amongst young adults is responsible for part of the decline. So I think there are many factors that are shaping this. I don't think it's only one thing, but I do think social media has had a significant and negative role. With regard to the motivation for using always in the one item on character, it's principally to try to keep the bar very high. These are self-report, so these are subject to social desirability biases, self-deception biases. We often see pretty high scores on the character items in spite of trying to word these quite strongly, so it's a way to try to avoid getting all 10s. One might be skeptical that we're getting any sort of meaningful data here at all, given those issues. And while I do think it's the fact that people are exaggerating and maybe reports of a 9 and a 7 should have been a 7 and a 5, the fact that one person says 9 and another person says 7 does actually give you meaningful data. And this one question, I always act to promote good in all circumstances, even in difficult and challenging situations, turns out to be a question out of 40 different well-being questions that is most predictive of subsequent well-being, controlling for the same outcomes at baseline. So people's responses to this, I think, are meaningful. Are they perfectly accurate? Absolutely not. Should we compare across individuals? No, not necessarily, but we are getting meaningful information. Moreover, if we start tracking over time, those self-report and self-deception biases are probably going to be relatively constant. And so again, we can do reasonable tracking, even though this is self-reported data.
Our next question from Professor Jim Franklin.
If humans are rational animals, then surely being rational should be important to flourishing. I mean, if you have 400 published articles, I'm guessing intellectual flourishing is really, really important to you. How do you think we're doing with intellectual flourishing?
I think we've got a ways to go. I think there has been decline, and we have begun work on trying to assess what we are calling academic flourishing within our universities, looking at not just our individuals flourishing on college campuses, but is the university flourishing as a community, using those flourishing assessments, and then also asking students' perceptions of how university life is helping them to grow in character, to develop wisdom, to help them in their pursuit of knowledge, to develop a love of learning, to work with others across divides, to understand different perspectives. And my guess is that we were just starting this data collection with 5 universities this year, but I don't think the picture is going to be particularly pretty. We have also embedded, our full assessment on this notions of academic flourishing and the contribution of university life to character, including growth in the intellectual virtues, is 20 questions long. We've managed to embed 6 of these questions in the Wall Street Journal's assessment of U.S. colleges in universities. So this will go out to about 50,000 students in 600 different colleges in universities. And while it won't be part of their formal rankings, we'll be able to provide alternative rankings with regard to students' perceptions and how university life has helped them to grow in wisdom or not. Likewise, for justice, for working across disagreement. And I suspect the rankings will look rather different with regard to growth and wisdom, for example, than the Wall Street Journal's standard rankings. Our hope is that this will then create a conversation around what is academic flourishing and our universities being faithful to what are often embedded in their mission and values statements with regard to growth and wisdom, service, knowledge, rational discourse, intellectual virtues, and perhaps help restore at least some universities that do care about these matters towards that. I do think assessing something like the intellectual virtues, knowledge and wisdom is not at all straightforward. And so our efforts are not directly doing that. I think much of that really can only come through individual conversation, through mentorship, through teaching. But we're trying to use these measurement efforts, the students' perceptions, not of their own wisdom, but of the contribution of university life to their growth in wisdom, to address some of these matters and to try to, we hope, help with change.
I just wanted to broaden the COVID and the social media question. There are things that declare war on flourishing, drugs policy, for example. How are these just treated as causations in your research, or how do you incorporate these things?
Yeah, certainly we could go on and on about other causes that have brought about the decline in flourishing amongst youth or in society more broadly. We have seen in the United States, for example, levels of happiness and life satisfaction declining over the past decade, not just with youth, but with the adult population as well. So certainly you'd be able to speak, obviously, to the Australian context much better than me, but the opioid crisis in the United States has certainly been a major factor as well, and has even led to declines in life expectancy after 100 years of progress in that regard. And so I think the list of factors is long. I think with regard to youth specifically, again, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but in the United States, there's been an increasing move away from discipline within schools. And recent research that I learned about just recently from the New York public school system, that it's those schools in more disadvantaged neighborhoods that are implementing systems of consistent discipline that are doing better than those that are not. But I think that has been an issue both with the practice of schools and to a great deal within parenting practices as well, and the messages that parents are receiving. I think another factor contributing to the decline in well-being of youth that I hadn't mentioned earlier pertains to the current world situation. Not just the experience of COVID-19, but also the recent wars that we've been experiencing, concerns about global warming as well. And while these things are confronting everyone, for older adults, there has been a longer period of relative, comparative stability. For youth today, this is the only world that they know, and it can feel threatening. So again, I think it's worthwhile looking at all of these different causes, trying to understand, trying to do what we can to address them. But I also think it's very valuable to look at what we can do to promote in positive ways well-being, even if we can't address all of the ills of our society. I would not take an either-or approach, that we either have to focus on the positive factors or addressing those challenges, but let's seek to do both. Those challenges and difficulties and factors that are leading to a decline in well-being, let's try to address. I'm not sure we can completely get rid of social media, but perhaps we can have better restrictions on use within schools. But that factor will probably continue to lead to declines in well-being for youth for at least some time to come. We might not be able to completely eliminate it. But again, there are positive things we can do, these well-being activities, participation in communities, and I think policies oriented towards supporting the well-being of young people are all things we can positively do to try to advance flourishing in society to provide that hope.
Thank you very much, Tyler. Thanks for those generous responses to the questions. No doubt there'll be more, but we will have supper very soon in our main dining room, and you can pepper him with your questions there for as long as he's keen to hang around for.
It's my privilege to offer a vote of thanks this evening to Professor Tyler Vanderwill for his highly informative and wide-ranging lecture on well-being, human flourishing and hope in an anxious century. I'd like to start by thanking Scots College and its Research Centre for organising Professor Vanderwill's visit to Australia. Professor Vanderwill has spent the last week in residence at Scots as their 2024 Clark Fellow. And I also want to thank Tyler for agreeing to give this lecture after an exhausting journey across the Pacific last Sunday and an intense week of work. As an Australian, I can certainly empathise with anyone experiencing profound jet lag. Perhaps the single most impressive feature of Professor Tyler Vanderwill's work is its ambition. His work draws upon philosophy and theology, but also social science and statistics to answer some of the most fundamental research questions that one could ask. What is the good life? What is the good society? What is the role of institutions like religion, marriage, and the family in promoting human well-being? Can forgiveness and love be measured? Can they be promoted? Tyler proposes practical, evidence-based solutions, both individual and communal, to the various societal challenges we face. Now, tonight's lecture had anxiety as a theme, and there has been a well-documented uptick in anxiety among young people in the last decade. There's a risk that our response to this challenge stays at the level of individual life hacks that are only band-aid solutions for the many challenges that young people face today. I once saw a single-frame cartoon which was a reference to Franz Kafka's novel, The Metamorphosis. It was of a cockroach lying on its back in a bed in a bedroom, and the caption was, "Have you tried mindfulness?" Professor Vanderwill's flourishing framework, in contrast, situates individual mental well-being within a social matrix that includes not only one's quality of mind, but also moral character, meaning and purpose, and close social relationships. He also brings into view the social determinants of well-being in a way that allows us to consider how factors like educational attainment, meaningful work, religious community, and family life affect mental health and well-being generally. So tonight we've heard a hopeful message of about what a society, but also what a university can do to create a healthy environment for students and staff. And indeed, I think Tyler's ability to reflect on what it means to create a flourishing university community has actually been enriched in the past 2 years, given robust debate in the United States about intellectual diversity on college campuses. In fact, Professor Vanderwill has himself been subject to his fair share of criticism from students for expressing views that conflict with progressive orthodoxies on campus. This was something that didn't quite come up this evening, but that Tyler could definitely talk to. And I can attest to the fact that while at Harvard, during this period, Tyler acquitted himself with the utmost dignity and I think charity towards students who perhaps were, not perhaps, were definitely waging a kind of fairly sort of like manifestly unjust campaign against Professor Vanderwill for I think challenging in a very healthy way some of the kind of assumptions that students bring to university about the good life. So Professor Vanderwill's reflections on both in his lecture and in the question time tonight have hopefully stimulated reflection on how genuinely free and open university environments are an important part of a flourishing society. So without further ado, I'd like to present Tyler with our traditional Warrane College necktie and tumbler and also a bottle of wine after a long week, which I'm sure won't go to waste. Thanks very much, Tyler. Great.